Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Psychology of Business podcast. My name is Brandon Griffin, and we have a very exciting episode for you today. So, as you know, I am an assistant professor of management, and a lot of what I do in my day to day job is teaching students, is serving on committees, but probably the most relevant thing, what I do as an academic, has to do with scholarly research. And the person we're talking to today, Dr. Dana Hermanson, he is one of the great accounting scholars of our day. But something that he has done is he is trying to make his research more relevant, make it more important for the academic community, but also make it more important for the day to day lives of business people and people throughout the world. So it's a discussion that he has had in the literature for a long time, but it's something that I recently have found some of his work. I saw some of his posts through LinkedIn, so I reached out and asked if I could do an interview for him, and we've corresponded back and forth a little bit. So I want to introduce to you today Dr. Dana Hermanson. How's it going, Dana?
It's going great, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today, Brandon.
So before we dive in, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, your professional background, and what you're doing today?
Sure. So, in terms of professional background, I always knew I wanted to be an accounting professor because my dad was an accounting professor. So that has run in the family. My sister Susan's an accounting professor, and my wife Heather is an accounting professor as well. So it's an exciting family. Um, my professional career really began at Ernst & Young here in Atlanta. So I was an auditor for 3 years, met my wife at the firm, and we went to the University of Wisconsin together and got our PhDs, which Heather has described as the equivalent of packing 25 years of marriage into a doctoral program. But came out of there in 93, came to Kennesaw State, and have been here ever since. I tell people I feel like I've taught at 4 different universities, although I've never moved. We've gone, I think we're just over 50,000 students now, PhD program. My wife heads up the Master of Accounting program. So it's been a fun place to see, thrive and grow over the years. And it's a place that has given me tremendous flexibility and freedom through the years. And that's part of the push that I've had in the literature in recent years, is trying to encourage more schools to adopt this broader mindset that there's life beyond the top 6 journals. There are a variety of different audiences out there that can benefit from what we do. And I try to reach many, many different audiences. In terms of topical areas, a lot of my work is in fraud, particularly the human side of fraud. So I'll talk some about the fraud diamond today. Do a lot of work in corporate governance, audit committee issues, board issues, compensation committees, nominating committees. So strong focus on corporate governance, as well as some focus in auditing and even accounting education topics. But really try to publish everything from, shoot for the top 6 and, usually fail, to other academic journals, accounting education journals, practitioner journals, letters to the editor. I think I've published over 250 letters to the editor now on different policy topics, speak to local groups, bring research into the classroom. So I really envision this kind of circle of audiences out there where different kinds of insights that we come up with can hit in different spots initially. And then a process I call pinballing. If you can have insights, perhaps start with an academic paper, and then you present those findings to a local group. You use them in class. You publish a practitioner article referencing the academic article. Reference the findings in a letter to the editor. You're covering a lot of different audiences. So I always tell people, the acceptance of a paper at an academic journal is a wonderful thing, but it shouldn't be the end of the story. In some ways, it should be the beginning of the story as you try to take that message to other audiences as well.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So I'm an assistant professor of management. You're a professor of accounting. So we're
Mhm.
both in colleges of business, but our fields are a little bit different. So let me describe kind of my thought in academia in general of what, a researcher does, of what a professor does. So different universities have different research expectations. There's based on the Carnegie classifications, which is a ranking of research output and essentially how much money and prestige a school has with research. An R1 institution, these top institutions, the people who go work at these schools, those are people who want to publish in those top 6 journals, like, accounting journals, or the top few management journals, top journals in their field, where they only accept, a small percentage of articles every year, where there's multiple or small percentage of articles they submit where there's a lot of revise and resubmission. But these are kind of these top journals. We have our two schools where those professors are still aiming for those top journals, but it maybe broadens up a little bit. But kind of the core of what academic research is to publish these articles into these top journals where they are going to be read by kind of the top scholars of the field. It's very prestigious. It's very impressive where are publishing in these. And the research that people do in these journals are supposed to be cutting edge. It's supposed to be using the top statistical techniques. It's using tools that are, really at the leading edge. But you published a paper a couple of years ago, um, comparing what you refer to as Model 1 with something that you call Model 2. Is my explanation of kind of this Model 1 right? What would you add to that? And how would you contrast that with this Model 2 that you are explaining and talking?
Yeah, yeah. I think you've captured the issue, and that so often I think the reward system dominates the research process. And Model 1 I characterize as, if you're at a school where you've got a tablet, publish in the top, 3, top 6 journals, whatever it is, X number of pubs in the first 6 years, and Y number of additional pubs to make full. I think it's very easy and understandable how this happens, that the research process gets flipped around. In other words, people start with the outlet. I got to publish in these journals. And then they go look at those journals, say, okay, these journals tend to focus in these areas using these methods. So now I've got my journal, I've got my topical area and method, and now I've got to run around and try to find a research question, and then perhaps loosely link that to some sort of current practice issue. But you're starting with the journal, and the practice issue is last. I call that Model 1 thinking. What I talked about in the paper that was in Critical Perspectives is start with a practice question. In other words, start with something that's important in your field and then work forward. So a practice question can lead to a research question. And then I strongly believe that a research question is what should drive your method. So if you want to understand, how do audit committees evaluate information? Well, a good place to start would be to interview audit committee members about how they evaluate information. If you're looking for how does manipulating this variable affect judgments, well, that's probably going to be an experiment. You'll have others that lead to survey, that lead to archival, you name it. But it's critical, in my view, to let the research question then lead to the research method. And I try to do, working with different people, I basically cover all the methods except for mathematical, agency modeling. So I figure if I can't read it and understand it, I certainly can't do it. But pretty much everything else, I'm currently involved in. And then once you've got the study, you've got the findings, you've got a product. Now let's figure out the appropriate outlet. So my push with Model 2 is, let's start with interesting questions, work through, and then the last thing we think about is what's the appropriate outlet. Model 1 is start with the outlet, work back, and possibly touch on some current important issue. But I think it gets tougher to get that magic where you're addressing something rigorously that's also of current importance if you're putting the question last. And ultimately what I want to do is work on interesting questions, find a good initial home for the project, and then, as I mentioned before, try to get this pinballing process going where we're going to then share those insights with different types of audiences.
Mm-hmm. And something that says in your bio, and if you go to Google Scholar, I was looking last night, I think you have something over 22,000 citations. You're someone who's established in the accounting field, but people who publish in these, top 6 journals, I don't think they start out with the premise of, I'm going to do this. I don't think they implicitly start with the premise, I'm going to publish in this journal. I'm going to do whatever I can to publish in this journal. I don't care what the question is. What they research is interesting to them. So do you think this is something that people, I don't want to say subconsciously do, but do you think they lose kind of the reason why we do research just by focusing on this? What limitations exist in this traditional academic model? Is it limiting what people research? What's is the real problem with that approach?
I think it limits topics, it limits methods. One good thing I've definitely seen in the accounting space in the last 10 to 15 years is qualitative, interview-based studies are now getting published in top journals. It used to be that, that just wasn't the case. Some greater acceptance of survey-based work as well, but archival, you can't go wrong. Um, Experimental, can be tough, but I think it certainly, if you're focused on a small set of journals, you've got a small set of editors with strong preferences, strong track records, and it just kind of constrains the sphere of both topics and methods that can be used. And what I try to think about is, God, what's a really interesting question? Now, what can we do with that? And too often, I kind of hear people going through this mindset of, that doesn't have top tier potential. I'll set that aside. Yeah, that method is, they're kind of squeamish about that method. I'm not going to give that a shot. But to give you a sense of the unpredictability of impact, my most cited paper is in the CPA journal. It's a practitioner journal. So it was, I assume, reviewed by a couple of practitioners. There's no theory. It was simply an article proposing an expansion of the fraud model that we use. Historically, we've used the fraud triangle. I worked with a forensic accountant. It was completely his idea that, there's a side missing from this model. And it was based on his experience as a fraud investigator. Now, we put this out. It's the fraud diamond. It has a fourth side: capability, the talent, the skill set, the personality type that you need to orchestrate a fraud. My most cited paper. And it's a 4-page thought piece in a practitioner journal. So I think, even though I've got some top 6 hits out there, if you were to ask people, what's Hermanson known for? Fraud Diamond's going to be number 1. Probably our fraud monographs for a group called COSO would be number 2. And then third might be one of the top 6 papers on the audit committee process. So I think there's this prevailing notion that when you focus on top 3 or top 6, everything in there is wonderful and impactful, and everything outside of that won't be. That has not been my experience at all. I think there's
And
a
that's really
great
interesting.
unpredictability. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. So, as someone who's an assistant professor, I don't have tenure yet. I'm working towards that. I'm in a school that's more teaching and research balanced between the two. So I'm not at a high level R1. I'm not at Ohio State. I'm not at Michigan. I'm not at a school like that. So my research expectations are a little bit more accepting of practitioner pieces of something at or maybe at a B level or C level journal. But do you think for researchers who are at those really research intensive universities, do you think they can take these kinds of risks where they focus more on the idea that may not be able to go to one of these top 6 journals versus you, someone who has those hits, someone who has this CPA hit, but it has 5,000 citations or whatever number it's at right now? Do you feel like you're in a position where you can change the model because you've walked through the steps of model 1?
I hope to be able to have some impact, but I realize that I'm up against the reality of the academic labor market, which is a tough foe. Um, the other thing I would stress is I think if you're in the top 4, top 6 kind of world, if that's the world that your school is in, it's very difficult to deviate from that, because it becomes an issue of not just things that you publish that are outside the top 6, don't count. They may actually count against you. Why are you wasting your time on this? You should be doing, your, Academy of Management. That's the place you got to be, and nothing else counts. So I think that's an issue. What I encourage people to really focus on is a fit between what they want to do and what the school is looking for. So if you think about the KSU environment or the Troy environment, lot of freedom, a lot of flexibility. You can shoot for A+, you can do C's, you can do everything in between, you can do some practitioner stuff. I thrive in that environment. I like to have a lot of things going at once. That environment may not be that wonderful for somebody who really wants to focus on elite publications. Probably don't have the resources that you would need, and may not get the credit. I've only going up for tenure, maybe they've got 3 publications, but they're all in A+. And, folks are used to seeing 10 or 12 publications, or, whatever the number is. So I think fit is a really, really big deal. Certainly there's more freedom that comes post tenure. But I think school selection would be the dominant issue, really getting at the place that fits what you want to do. And I knew coming out, and it was partially the reality of husband-wife couple looking for two jobs too, that, we weren't going to end up at Ohio State or, Michigan or someplace like that. Just wasn't going to happen. And frankly, landed at KSU thinking, we'll be there 2-3 years, let the labor market get better. And, 33 years later, here we are. And it's been a great ride.
And how does your wife feel? She's an accounting professor as well. Is she of a similar mindset?
Yeah, very similar mindset. She's been running our Master of Accounting program the last several years. She's actually going to retire next year. But both of us have just thoroughly enjoyed the freedom, the flexibility. We just don't have that hanging over our heads of, oh my gosh, it takes one more A plus to get to the next level, or one more A plus to get the raise, or whatever it is. Everything counts. And as I said before, impact is very, very unpredictable, and it's nice to be able to take a lot of shots, and once in a while something really sticks and gets some traction.
Well, good. So let's talk about some of that impact you've been making. So moving away from, the I don't want to say confines because that makes it sounds limiting, but from the specific criteria of, kind of this out of your PhD, you want to publish in these top 5 journals. What real world or societal issues have you been focusing on right now with your Model 2, with your expanded research approach?
Yeah. So several buckets. I would say one really big bucket is fraud and the people side of fraud. And it goes back a number of years. In 1997, I was working with 2 other co-authors, Joe Carcello at Tennessee and Terry Neal at Tennessee, on an archival project where we were digging through SEC enforcement actions against companies related to fraudulent financial reporting. And really started to get, and I'm sorry, Mark Beasley at NC State, Terry was on the second one. But really digging through these, getting a sense of fraudulent financial reporting cases. And my mindset at that point was all at the company level. Okay, so company X overstated their revenues and company Y overstated their assets. And I thought of everything at sort of the company level. And then it was probably late 2003, maybe early 2004, I had a guest speaker in my graduate forensic class, David Wolfe, who's a forensic accountant, fraud investigator. And as he spoke to the class, he asked a very simple question that ended up changing my research career and my teaching career. Most impactful question that I had ever heard. And he simply asked the class, what's the number one cause of fraud? And my students we had studied the fraud triangle, so there were a lot of answers related to incentive or pressure. There were a lot of answers related to opportunity, a lot of answers related to rationalization and attitude. David stood up there and kept shaking his head. No, that's not what I'm looking for. And I'm sitting, I don't know what the guy's looking for. And he said, the number one cause of fraud is people. And it was like, poof. And he went on to share some of the implications of that. One was that we'll never get fraud to zero. Any system that has people in it, somebody's going to do something crazy. After class, though, he said, I've been kicking around an idea. And if you think it has merit, would you be willing to work with me to write it up? And he said, give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes, I'll pitch this idea. And basically what he argued was, if you believe what I said in class, that the number one cause of fraud is people, the fraud model that we use and that auditors use misses the person, because incentive or pressure tells you about the situation that somebody's in. There's a pressure to meet a target, or a supervisor is putting pressure on them to do something, or there's personal financial pressure. But that's really all the situation. Instead, if you think about opportunity to commit fraud, that's all about weak internal controls, weak board oversight. Those are characteristics of the setting. The third side of the triangle is rationalization and attitude. So that's trying to figure out what somebody else might be able to rationalize. You said that's focused on the person, but it's real squishy. How do you tell what somebody else can rationalize? We don't have a good answer for that. He said, here's what's missing. He said, the person who I see in case after case after case, who has the right temperament and the right skill set to be able to exploit a fraud opportunity. They can recognize it and they can exploit it. And he said, I call this capability. And he said, they've got to be smart. They've got to have the right formal access. They've got to be able to deal with stress. They have to be able to lie effectively, coerce others, etc. So he had 6, components of this all laid out. What do you think? So I think it makes a lot of sense. Let's write it up. So we got, in that process of writing it up, and we had a little discussion about, where should we go with this thing? And let's just get it out there. Let's send it to a practitioner journal. We don't have any theory. This is all based on David's investigation experience. So let's throw it out there and let people do with it what they will. So we sent it to the CPA journal in 2004, and it got published. But that really started a journey for me with interview-based projects. We also had an opportunity with some other folks to do an audit committee interview project. So I'm sort of getting this people notion from David's work, the fraud diamond. I'm starting to do more experimental work, more interview work, and everything was coming back to people, people, people. And, a lot of ways to address the fraud problem, with data analytics and AI and everything else. But for me, the people side has been fascinating. So we've got a project now where a co-author interviewed people who had been convicted in collusive fraud cases. So focused on the process of how do fraud teams form? How do they operate? How do they break apart at the end? We've interviewed perpetrators about the long-term impacts of fraud, not on companies, but on the perpetrators themselves. Fascinating to see what those long-term impacts are. So a lot of my work is around this human side of fraud, and it really is a message, to my students and to others that fraud risk is not independent of the people in the positions. You've got to assess the people in addition to assessing the setting and the controls and everything else. Fraud risk varies across individuals. So that has just been a fascinating ride for the last 20 years.
And I feel like you're coming over to my world a little bit when you
Yes.
start thinking about people and personality. I started thinking about management, and I actually started out my undergrad in accounting, and I went to BYU for a little bit, and I know they have a big PhD prep in accounting, and I transferred to another school, but one of my professors, Kari Olson, he did a lot of work with dark triad and CEO narcissism and stuff like that, and that's what kind of got my mind focused on the people aspect of fraud or of overstating earnings or just seeing the impact of that. And he's an accounting researcher, but I think that is so important, the people side. Before I hit record on this interview, we were talking about why I do this podcast, and it's the
Yep.
people aspect. It's the story
Yes.
aspect of that. But
Yep.
I do think that fourth side of the triangle, which now isn't a triangle, it's a diamond, is so important. So what are you doing with that it was in a practitioner journal? What impact has that had on the scholarly and broader community?
It was interesting. We threw it out there in 2004, and of course I got a million things going on, not really paying attention. It's getting a few sites here and there. Started to see it pop up really more on the professional side. Not surprisingly, we published in a professional journal. And then around 2014, so we're a decade later, one of my co-authors at Alabama, Todd DeZort, said, a lot of people are drawing these fraud models. People love to draw the models. We got a diamond, we got pentagons, we got hexagons, we've got octagons. But he said, nobody's really testing these models. Would you be interested in testing? I said, sure, let's do it. So Todd and I worked with Doug Boyle, who was a student of mine here at KSU in the PhD program, or DBA program at that time. Doug is now at the University of Scranton. So the three of us did a test of the triangle versus the diamond, and simply wanted to know, does it make a difference which model auditors use as they assess fraud risk? So, in a nutshell, sort of a common set of information about a hypothetical company. Then we walk you either through a fraud triangle practice aid or a fraud diamond practice aid, and then have you assess the risk of financial statement fraud at the company at the end. And what we found was those who used the diamond assessed fraud risk 17% higher than those who used the triangle. So causing people to focus on the capability elements affected fraud risk assessments. So the model mattered. After that, things really started to explode on the academic side. I think it took some testing, and a paper paper was in Journal of Accounting and Public Policy, an A-level journal, where we really started to get some attention on the academic side, and that was the beginning of the explosion of the citations and the testing of different elements of capability, with a number of studies coming through and say, yeah, intelligence really matters, and ego really matters. So people are testing, different portions of the list of capability factors, and serving to further validate the model.
That is wonderful. So, it started out in a practitioner journal, got a little bit of support, from the professional literature, but once you empirically tested it, it kind of exploded.
Yep,
And
exactly.
that's what I think is really interesting. If you apply that 17% number to financial
Yep,
statements or to fraud, that can have a real world,
yep,
dollar value of the impact that you're having. So if you can include this fourth side, you're going to limit
yep,
fraud, you're going to save money, you're going to
yep.
have these things. So I think that's really great. What
Yeah.
else are
So
you working on?
another issue was really kind of COVID prompted, and that's remote work. And it kind of fits in with this whole fraud and people focus. Um, and it struck me one day as I was talking to students. I'm up in front of the room, and we've covered the fraud diamond, and I'm, the question, what do you do about this capability element? And I'm telling you, well, you got to get to know people. You got to assess people. You got to see how their behavior changes over time, face-to-face interactions, et cetera. And we're doing this, during this COVID period. And even after we get through COVID, start to ask my students questions like, how many of you had completely remote internships? And most of the hands go up. How many of you were involved in audit engagements where you never met the client? And a lot of hands are going up. And I finally one day in class, I said, wait a minute. So I'm up here telling you that you need to know and assess people. And what you're telling me is you often don't even know who the people are. And they all laughed. And I thought, I think there's a paper there. And so I wrote a commentary piece that was published earlier this year about this phenomenon of auditors doing much more work remotely, initially because of COVID. And, some of that is persisting. The pendulum's kind of swinging around now, but I've referred to this as the jammy pants audit. Auditors are sitting at home in their jammy pants, and I may or may not be wearing jammy pants right now. But auditors are sitting at home in their jammy pants at the same time that the literature on fraud in accounting is focused more and more on people. A lot of focus on dark triad, a lot of focus on capability. And you sort of have the two diverging here, where one camp is saying know people, assess people, spend time with people. And yet the reality of practice, understandably because of COVID at first, but it's persisting to some extent, is no, we're off site. You send us the data, we'll crunch through. We've got data analytics, we've got AI. We don't even need to know who the people are. And it was just an interesting divergence. So I wrote a commentary piece about it, and have shared it with, spoken to a couple regulators as well about this issue of keep an eye on the jammy pants audit, because my fear is that there's a lot that you miss when you're not on site. You're not reading people. You don't necessarily know what the vibe is in the organization. It just puts the auditor in a challenging position. I think it's an empirical question whether the gains through data analytics and AI will be enough to offset the cases where we just don't know the people that we're auditing anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people when they were finishing their PhD, there were viral photos of them, that from the waist up, they're
Yes.
in the suit with the waist down, literally in their jammy pants. I had a friend
Yep.
did that, and he said, I wanted to wear slippers. So I think
Yes.
he wore his slippers during his defense. That is awesome. That's really interesting. And I think it is true because, as me finishing up my PhD, there were times when I was on online class, and kind of like what I have it right now. I have a Mac laptop that's hooked up to my phone so I can have the camera, but I also have my computer up here. I'm not gonna lie, there were times when I may have been a little bit distracted,
Yep.
on the internet doing something I wasn't supposed to. But I could definitely see how you can have this false sense of security of, we have AI tools. I don't need to be there in person. Just our company runs through this software. Why do I even have to be there in person?
Yes.
Well, if we have these auditors and you're training these auditors, there's that, this misalignment between what you're teaching, what actually happens, the pendulum's going back and forth of in person, online. So I think that's a really great
Yeah.
thing that you were exploring.
Yeah, and it raises others have done research on other implications. Socializing new auditors, training. The mentorship, apprenticeship kind of model. There are just a number of challenges that have to be managed to the extent that you've got remote work. And what I say to my students all the time is, for an old guy like me, going remote, big deal. I already knew everybody I was working with. For me, the challenge was, making sure I understand the technology. But I say to them all the time, you can maintain an established career in a remote world. It's hard to build a new career in a remote world. You just got to get out and meet people, spend time with people, pick up on the little things, over lunch and, informal discussions, I think is really important.
That's something I've found very interesting as someone who makes these podcast videos. You're someone who on Google Scholar looks intimidating,
Right.
if 22,000
Yeah.
citations plus. I sent you an email and you replied to me same day. Let's do it. Come on, let's hop on a call. I'm surprised how easy it is to network just
Yes.
by talking with people a little personally, something they're interested in.
Yes.
So I completely agree with that.
Yeah. One thing I always tell junior people in academia is never hesitate to reach out to somebody who's senior and established. With a paper idea, whatever it is. A joint project is a win-win. It's great. It's not a burden. I think so many even when it comes to co-authoring, I think so many senior faculty are motivated simply by being on projects with younger people. Uh,
Well, good. So your COVID paper, your fraud paper, those are more accounting focused. But what about broader societal issues? Has your model too expanded you beyond,
yes.
the accounting realm?
Yeah, and it varies a little bit between formal papers versus letters to the editor. Letters to the editor, I go all the way. I sort of think of circles where, with letters to the editor, I started with accounting issues and then governance issues and then business issues. Then you get out to policy, and now you're starting to take a stand. Well, policy is inherently political. It's right there in the name. So you get into political issues. So I've sort of run the whole gamut with letters to the editor. But in terms of more formal papers, one area that I'm really passionate about that I've been hitting in both realms is this whole socialism versus capitalism issue. And I think that's probably the post you saw on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It was essentially, I can't believe that we're having this whole argument and this debate again. And I think impressions wear off over time. Something isn't covered for some period of time. But with my generation, you think socialism and you think tens of millions of deaths and China and Soviet Union. And I think with younger people today, too often socialism, well, that's sharing and taking care of each other. It has a very, very different vibe than it did before. And so I have been very, very outspoken, both with the paper you saw that I posted on LinkedIn, as well as in letters to the editor, that, let's really appreciate what we're talking about with socialism versus capitalism. Let's be very clear. Number one, what are the two systems? But number two, what are the outcomes of the two systems? And I saw a great quote recently where a guy had been a socialist growing up and later became a capitalist. And he said, I realized the error of my ways. He said, I was judging capitalism by how harsh it seemed, and I was judging socialism by how nice it sounded. I needed to focus on the actual outcomes of which one really has reduced poverty globally, which one has the best outcomes. Um, so that's been a big focus and something that I will continue to focus on. The article I shared even has some classroom exercises with the exam tax and other things where you can kind of put socialism into the everyday life of a college student. I think about, okay, wait a minute. Okay, this is what they might be talking about. I don't get to keep all the points I earn in the class. Somebody else is getting those, and somebody else might be free riding on what I'm doing. That's a whole different discussion than this abstract notion of socialism. So that's
Could we
definitely
talk about
happening.
that for a little bit?
Sure.
Capitalism is socialism.
Yep.
So younger generations, I do think you're correct, have kind of been removed from Cold War, from the Soviet Union, from a lot of the dark days of coming out of World War II. When I think of socialism, kind of from a popular media perspective, it's this idea of let's share, let's make sure there's no poor among us, let's make sure that we kind of we don't want poor people. Billionaires can exist, but we don't want there to be poor people. So let's share. Let's um, just reduce poverty. Let's make sure people have all access to medical care. And I've interviewed people who have a negative view of capitalism because it's going to harm the environment. It's going to be greedy. People are going to be corrupt. It's just focusing on profit, kind of this Milton Friedman perspective on profit and shareholder value and everything. Where socialism, and I don't even know if that word is what people. It's still being used, but they might call it something a little bit different. But it's
Yeah.
this idea of just let's just make everyone be better. A rising tide's going to lift all boats.
Hmm.
So can you give us the rundown of why you're so passionate about
Yeah.
capitalism versus socialism for people who didn't grow up, post World War II, people who didn't grow up in the Cold War, post Cold War, and then people who haven't really seen the impacts of socialism in their day to
Yep.
day lives?
Yeah. What I often boil it down to, and I had a letter in the Atlanta paper a few weeks ago about this, is the key to generating wealth, whether we like it or not, is work. People need to work. There has to be effort expended to generate wealth. And as I look at different systems, the first question I ask myself is, does that system provide an incentive to work? And I have that same lens as I look at different policies. Does that policy provide an incentive to work? And I'm talking about, able-bodied, people. And as you look at capitalism, and many people have said this, what's remarkable about capitalism is it provides the incentive to work. Okay. Under all systems, people are greedy. Everybody's trying to get ahead. It's just that under capitalism, Daniel Hannan is a guy in the UK who expresses this beautifully. Says under capitalism, it's this wonderful system that it harnesses your desire for material gain in a way that's socially beneficial. You do better yourself, and you make other people better because you're engaging in fair trade. You'd like to produce certain product, they're happy to pay you for that product, and it's a win-win. So it provides this incentive to work. My concern with socialism is as soon as the game shifts to now I want to take the output of somebody else and rely on that, now you're starting to hurt the incentive to work. And there certainly will still be producers out there, but it kind of spreads like a contagion. Oh, okay, now I'm not going to work quite as high. I don't have the same incentive. I can't, benefit from the efforts I'm putting forward, and people start to pull back. The old Soviet joke: we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. So for me, it's a very simple lens of what provides the incentive to work. And I don't view work as a bad thing. I view work as self-sufficiency, the ability to gain new skills, to contribute. It's something that provides dignity. And I think too often people in our society talk about work as an evil thing. It's horrible that people have to work. That's terrible. No, it's wonderful. I mean, it's find something that you love to do, and it's truly a wonderful thing. And if it's not the current thing that you love to do, be working toward getting to the point where you love what you're doing. I even tell our accounting graduates, I would be one of them. I don't love technical accounting. But what I've done is I've carved out a career where I've actually described it as I'm basically a management professor in the accounting department, because I study how people behave in accounting settings. I don't study the accounting rules. I don't study the tax rules. I study how people behave in this setting. I've carved out something that I really, really love to do. And I wish that for everybody. So for me, that's a lot of the lens is thinking about the incentives, thinking about the incentive to work, and then also just looking globally and historically, where have we seen the highest standards of living? Unquestionably, where we've got free trade, we've got capitalism. It's just a remarkable record. And I appreciate the intention behind socialism, and I appreciate the sharing language. But I think when you look at the reality, things fall apart pretty quickly because the incentive to work takes a big hit.
And I agree. I think working, something for me personally, it gives me meaning. It gives me a
Yes.
lot of, something I want to ask you about the end of the conversation is
Hmm.
meaning in your life. But could you
Yeah.
give us a definition because you've talked a lot about incentives, you talked about a lot about free market, but could you give us a textbook definition of capitalism versus socialism, just to clearly define, d-
Yep.
separate what those two systems are?
Yeah. I mean, capitalism is free trade, it's private ownership, profit motive. Socialism is common or government ownership of the means of production. Yeah. And I think it's the actual definition of socialism that surprises a lot of people who might say they're socialists. You even see that in some of the polling where, you ask people, what do you think about? So, oh, I think socialism is pretty good. What do you think about government ownership of all business? Oh, gosh, no. Well, those are the same thing. Um, so I think part of it is a definitional thing. But I think there's a slippery slope if you go to 60% tax rates, 80% tax rates, those kinds of things, where you start to crush individual incentives so much that you've got potentially less income inequality, but it's because you've just squished everything down to the point where nobody's working that hard.
Is it a continuum? So is it a continuum from the fact, we have maybe people who are more libertarian who want
Hmm.
0% tax rate, just pay
Yeah.
whatever you actually use, to people who, I don't want to say communist 100%,
Yep.
but if we're at I don't even know what the effective tax rate is, 25, 20, 25. I know it's going to depend on
Yep.
your income and a lot of
Right.
stuff, but
Yeah.
is it like a continuum between scales, or is it kind of like capitalist socialist?
I think there could be a continuum in there with tax rates and government as a percentage of um, the overall economy. But I think that pure socialism that's when we got common or government ownership of the means of production, and that is very, very different than what people in this country have experienced. And it's interesting to hear from people who have grown up in systems like that and come to the US and then are just horrified to hear, my gosh, they're talking about socialism here. This is insanity. I came from that. You don't want any part of that. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's, I enjoy the world of academia, this model one we have of traditional academic research. I really enjoy what you're doing with the model two, and pursuing those things, and also pursuing broader societal issues like how you feel about capitalism and socialism. Is there anything else you want to share about your work, what you're doing now in terms of broader issues?
I mean, I would say some other broader issues that I have written about. One is national debt. I think if young people want something to worry about, it ought to be national debt. That is a biggie, and I just think we have some structural flaws in our system where we don't have a balanced budget amendment. We have politicians who have an incentive to get reelected. How do you get reelected? By promising goodies, virtually without limit, because we can continue to raise the debt ceiling. So I think there's just a structural issue there that's going to be a biggie. I've written about, things like Obamacare, raising the question that if Obamacare is 15 years old and it requires indefinite subsidies, perhaps we need to look at the system and figure out what the root problem is there. So in many cases, when it comes to policy issues, rent control in New York City, et cetera, I always put the hat on of how could this policy go bad? What are the perverse incentives that are created? How could somebody game this? And many times those are the kinds of things that you see play out. We saw it during COVID when we had people making more in unemployment than they'd been making working before COVID, and then people were stunned that people weren't going back to work. What do you expect? It's incentives. So, so I often have that hat on and chime in on different policy issues with a focus on the perverse incentives and how could this lead to an outcome that was not intended. And it's just trying to think, if I were going to game this, what would I do?
Well, let's talk about your incentives. And I don't mean from a financial perspective, but
Yep.
you are nearing the latter part of your career. You've had a successful academic career, but looking back on your life, you said your dad was an accounting professor, and you knew you kind of always wanted to do that looking at him. But what ultimately brought you meaning and fulfillment in your career once you actually got into that accounting profession? I think back to my accounting classes of debits and credits and trying to make all these financial statements work. And someone might think, how can you have a fulfilling career like that?
Right.
But give us your take. How and why has your career been meaningful?
I got into this, I think, like so many other people, because I wanted to teach. And I knew that teaching would be tremendous, and it has been. So I expected it to be great, and it has been great. For me, the biggest surprise of this career has been that I love the research. And in addition, the research has actually become the center of my academic life. And I talked before about the circle of audiences. One of those audiences is the classroom. So I teach an undergraduate fraud and forensic accounting course that has a lot of stuff that we've written as the readings. There's no textbook in that class. Teach a graduate corporate governance course that is largely articles that we've written on audit committees, comp committees, you name it. So I've got this, early in my career, I was, doing research, running around trying to get enough stuff published, and I was teaching, a variety of different classes, and I felt like I had a research bucket over here, and I had a teaching bucket over here, and there might be a little bit of crossover, but not much. Today, it's research teaching buckets are right on top of each other. So that has been tremendously rewarding in that, it exposes students to research, gets them thinking about the issues the way that academics are thinking about them, but with practical implications. Two, it also provides incentive for me to always have new stuff coming out. I don't want to go on, I'm going to, share the stuff I've been working on, it's from 1996. No, I've always got fresh stuff. So I feel a bit like a songwriter who's going to go on the Tonight Show to talk about your latest stuff. I always got to have latest stuff to talk about, in part because I use my stuff in class. So that has been tremendously rewarding. I think another thing that's been really rewarding is the Kennesaw State model has provided just tremendous freedom. And I talked about this before, but it's freedom on topic, it's freedom on publication outlet, it's freedom on being normative or positive. So I can take a stand on issues. I don't have to worry that somebody from the dean's office is going to be calling. Why did you write that in a letter to the editor? None of that. So I just have tremendous freedom, and I have heard from a number of colleagues around the country who have said they wish they had that freedom at their institutions. We have a system here that's very focused on faculty free speech, and I've taken advantage of that, and it's been a tremendous career here for now in my 33rd year, being able to work on stuff I'm interested in, publish where I want to, speak out on the issues of the day, call it like I see it, and I've told the administration several times, you've ruined me for other schools. So
Maybe that was their plan. They're
yeah,
going to be stuck
exactly.
here for forever.
Yep. And the other thing I would say, particularly at this stage of my career, is I absolutely love working with younger co-authors. So virtually, I can think of a handful of exceptions, but virtually every recent project has involved a doctoral student, recent doctoral grad, sometimes a master's student, assistant professors. So I just absolutely love that process of working with people where they get their first pub and their second pub or their third pub, and see them go up through the ranks and get promoted, and so that has been tremendously rewarding.
Well, good. And that's something I'm working through right now. I remember when I got my first citation on Google
Yep.
Scholar, I'm like, oh my,
Yep.
I'm real. I made it.
Yep. But yeah, I mean, this is a wonderful career. One of my colleagues says, whenever he's asked when he's going to retire, he says to people, well, we have the job that people retire to. So why would I, would I want to retire? But yeah, I'm still having a great time. I get up every day excited about this. The review process can get you down at times, but you keep slugging away there and view that as a portfolio where some are going to go your way and some aren't. But yeah, wonderful career to get to interact with students, with younger co-authors, deal with interesting issues, write papers. Can't beat it.
Well, good. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your work, about your career, anything before we close today?
I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity, and and I really like the approach of focusing on the stories, focusing on what motivated you to get into this. I think that's fascinating. We've got a project that's actually under review at a journal now, where we interviewed 21 of the most um, successful accounting researchers of the past 3.5 decades. These are people who had to be in the top of the BYU Accounting Research Rankings. Yes, those do exist. All time and in the last 6 years. So these are all-timers who are still doing it. And as we distilled their responses down, we ended up coming up with 4 Ps that they viewed as the key to their success. 1 P was passion. Said you've got to be interested in the questions that you're looking at. Second was people. Junior co-authors, doctoral students, absolutely central. The third P was practice. In other words, accounting practice, the accounting profession. Said we don't get research ideas from other articles. We get research ideas from what's happening in the business world. And then the fourth P was the process. That you've got to manage your time, you got to do quality work, etc. And I thought it was a nice way of capturing what they viewed as the keys to research success. So passion, people, practice, and process that probably would prevail in some other disciplines as well.
I think that's a great way to end it. I think for accounting researchers, any researchers, but really any business students, do
Hmm.
something that you're interested in,
Yep,
do it high quality, and what I tell my students, I want them to get high paying, meaningful jobs, do something they enjoy and do
yep,
something that can pay you to live the life that you want within
yep,
reason.
yep, exactly.
All right. Well, Dana Hermanson, thank you so much for coming on, talking about the work that you do, talking about your model 2 for academic research, but talking about the larger societal issues that you're focusing on.
My pleasure. I appreciate it.
If people want to get in contact, do you do any consulting work? Do you do anything like that? If people listen to this and want to get in contact with you, do you do anything like that?
I do, speaking here and there. I've done some consulting over the years, not a tremendous amount, but always open to hear from people and see what the possibilities are.
And where can they reach you? Do you have a website, LinkedIn? Where can they reach you?
Yeah, LinkedIn would be easy, or just Google me and yeah, send me an email to the KSU email. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. This is Dr. Dana Hermanson talking about his new model for scholarship. Make sure you check out his work. I'm going to look for that new article with the 4 Ps of, the accounting professionals, the accounting academics. But everyone, you have a great day. Happy learning. I'll see you next time.